Good afternoon. Let's get started for today's talk. For next week, our speaker is going to be Mark Fischetti, who is the Energy and Environment Editor at Scientific American. Yes, sir.
Is it next week spring break?
That's a very good point, and this is the week after, so this is 22nd March. See, we don't have spring break. You guys have, but thank you. Yes, so this is a couple of weeks from now, 22nd March. And so Mark Fischetti is going to talk on the energy industry's media triumphs and disasters. It's going to be a very interesting talk. With that, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Mark Thurber. Mark is a former colleague at Stanford, and he is Associate Director for Research in the program on energy and sustainable development at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. Mark's research looks at institutional factors that affect the diffusion of technologies, both at the large scale, for example, carbon capture and storage or electricity markets, but also at the small distributed scale, for example, generators for the poor or household cook stoves. Some very fascinating work on a wide range of things that Mark has done, and I have had the good fortune of working with him and following some of that. He also focuses on the strategy and performance of dual firms, and these are firms that have connections both with the government but also have a commercial character. And national oil companies are actually, several of them are actually have this dual firm character. Mark has a PhD from Stanford University in mechanical engineering, the same program that I went for PhD, and he has a bachelor's degree in engineering from Princeton University. He's going to talk on national oil companies fueling anxiety, and Mark is going to say so much more. I just want to highlight that this was a project that I was very integrally involved with. Started working on this in 2007 with Mark and David Victor, and while I was a PhD student, continued doing that through a postdoc and completed it after I had come here and joined as a faculty member. So we all spent about 4.5 years starting this and finally completing the book. So what I'm going to do is circulate the book, which just came out January 2012, and you can have a look. Please return this copy. This is $150. So with that, I leave it to Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Varun. As you mentioned, I've had the pleasure of working with Varun on this project for a number of years, and I'm very happy to have the chance to come here and see him and talk to all of you. So what I'm going to talk about today is national oil companies fueling anxiety. So I thought a good hook for thinking about national oil companies was to really assess the kinds of hand-wringing about state-owned enterprises in energy and which parts of that are justified and which parts of that are not. I'm going to draw on the long-term project that Varun mentioned, which was released as a book at the end of this past year. This recent Economist cover, I think, very well illustrates sort of the emotional content about this rise of state capitalism. So it's Lenin with a cigar with a dollar sign on it. And I think this really illustrates the kind of thing that I want to think more critically about. Should we be worried about this? So when you think about state enterprises, NOCs are right at the top in level of importance. What you can see here is that it takes until the 8th position in oil reserves till you get to, this data is a few years old, but until you get to ExxonMobil, the largest international oil company. So certainly in terms of oil reserves, the NOCs are very dominant. A little less so in production, for reasons that I'll talk about, but still the top slot in oil is Saudi Aramco, top slot in natural gas around the world is Gazprom. So the red, all of the red and pink is state-controlled companies, and the black and gray is private companies. This is another way of looking at that mix. On the left, we're looking at oil reserves as of late 2009. On the right, it's oil production. So you can see that the gray shaded areas, which represent state-controlled companies, are roughly 3/4 of oil reserves and a little less of production. The PESD 15 NOCs, those were the ones that were covered in the book that Varun showed. Gas, the dominance is a little bit less for reasons that we'll talk about later, that gas proves to be a little bit different than oil, but again, still quite dominated by state-controlled companies.
Does this include shale gas?
Well, shale gas is still a relatively, I mean, the quick answer is no, and partly because this is a few years old, but shale gas is, so this is not incorporating changes in North American reserves from shale gas for the most part. I mean, that's still going to be a pretty small piece of this pie right now. But. So really, if we think about rise of state capitalism, a lot of that is about oil. And if you look at the biggest state-owned enterprises by revenue, they're Sinopec and CNPC, which are in the fifth and sixth position of all companies by revenue. So these are huge, and it's very much in oil and gas. Let's break this down a little. What kinds of things might be worrisome about this ascendance of national oil companies? One might be, what does this mean for private oil companies? Does this mean that the days of the big private oil majors are numbered, that they're going to sort of wither and die? Or is there a long-term future for these private international companies? A thing that's often stoked in the press is the idea that NOCs could be geopolitical weapons. I think case study A of this is Gazprom, that particularly in Europe people think about Gazprom cutting off the tap to serve purposes of Vladimir Putin. What about the effect of NOCs on gasoline prices? So certainly there's been a lot of attention to gasoline prices recently. The current administration seems to at least be implicitly linking prices with subsidies for private companies. Maybe questionable causality there, or even causality in the other direction. But maybe we should think about NOCs and what they mean for gasoline prices. And then finally, environmental impacts, whether climate or other kinds of environmental issues. What does it mean that NOCs are so important? The origin of the book that Varun introduced was the idea that these NOCs are very important in the oil markets, and yet the understanding of them is still limited. And notably, that they behave quite differently from private oil companies. And so if we really want to understand the oil market, we need to understand what those differences are. And then another observation is that within NOCs, there's a huge range of variation in how they behave. So we want to understand that as well. So that was really what drove this project in the beginning. This is our sample of the 15 country NOC combinations that we ended up choosing. And these were selected based on a number of criteria. One was we wanted to have good geographic variation. We wanted variation in political system, in kinds of resources that they were tapping. And we also wanted to make sure that we covered the most important players. So you had to have Saudi Aramco, you had to have Gazprom. So of these, Varun actually was our author for ADNOC in Abu Dhabi and ONGC in India. And I was involved with, in addition to being involved on the book overall, I worked on the Statoil and NNPC case studies. It's worth starting by thinking a little bit about the term national oil company, because when you break it down, it's perhaps wanting in some respects. First of all, national. Well, a lot of these NOCs, or at least a reasonable number now, are starting to operate abroad or think about operating abroad, so they're not anymore limited by their own national borders. Many of them are in natural gas as much as oil, and sometimes a lot else. Sometimes these NOCs play in areas outside of hydrocarbons, period. And then company. Some of these are more like regulatory agencies or other government bodies. Some I find just almost impossible to characterize. NNPC in Nigeria, I certainly wouldn't call it a company, but I don't know exactly what I would call it. So I propose this alternative term, state-controlled entity involved with hydrocarbons. So this is much more precise. These will be SKUEs. But I think just till the end of the slide. So we'll go with NOCs. It's more tractable. An initial observation about NOCs is that they do demonstrably produce their reserves more slowly. So this was data for the 15 NOCs in our sample and the 6 super major IOCs on the right, using Wood Mackenzie data on commercial and technical reserves and then working interest production. So the short answer here is you see that there's about a factor of 2 difference. NOCs produce about a factor of 2 less of their reserves each year. So the question, though, is why? The initial thought might be, well, they're lousy companies. They're inefficient. They can't produce as much as they would like. But then when you start to dig in, it becomes a much more complex picture. Perhaps this is partly about inflation of reserves estimates, which is certainly something OPEC members have every incentive to do. Or maybe this is deliberate strategy, that these companies are intentionally serving their governments by not extracting as quickly as IOCs, preserving the resources. I think what the idea of strategy gets to the question of, well, what are these different companies trying to do? And that was something that in our work proved really fundamental to understanding NOCs, is you start with what their goals are. For an IOC, that's pretty straightforward because their owners are shareholders, and so they're responsible to maximize and grow profits for their shareholders. But NOCs are more complicated, and so I'm going to step back a moment and think about a concept that proved very helpful to us when we were doing this research, which is principal-agent theory, and I suspect many or most of you have run across this already. But the idea here is this comes up in a huge range of situations. Basically, any time when I want you to do something for me as my agent that I can't do very effectively by myself. What are the problems with this? Well, there are 2 principal problems. One is that the objective functions of the agent and the principal are often different, and sometimes very different. So maybe I want somebody, my lawyer or my doctor, to be as conscientious and diligent in what I'm asking them to do, but maybe they just want to do the least work for the most money. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is they know a lot more than I do about what they're doing. So this is this information asymmetry. The result of both of those is that the principal has to set up some kind of incentive structure and put in some monitoring scheme to try to get the agent to do what it wants. And governments perceived, resource-rich governments started to perceive in the 60s and 70s that this principal-agent relationship really wasn't working for them. So this was the relationship between governments and the private international companies, that the governments thought that it was quite likely that they were being taken for a ride. And this is part of what drove, especially starting in the 70s, a lot of these nationalizations. So the idea was, on the government's part, that this is great because all we have to do is we create this oil company that's part of the government. So they can learn how to extract oil and everything they need to know, but you erase the information asymmetry because we're all on the same team. In practice, it didn't work out to be quite so simple because the principal-agent relationship comes up again, and still the NOC doesn't have the same kinds of incentives. But the important point is the incentives at least reflect in some way what their principal wants, and their principal is very different from the principal of a shareholder-owned firm. So whereas the IOCs have pretty straightforward objectives, NOCs can do an enormous range of things. One of them is usually to do commercial types of functions in oil and gas. But beyond that, they can fund a major part of the government budget. They frequently subsidize domestic fuel. They can provide social programs. That's PDVSA is an example of that in Venezuela. Employment is very common, that they provide employment for a lot of people. In places where institutions are weak overall, the NOCs can serve as a general government agency to build highways, build hospitals, do a lot of things that there aren't other competent agents to do. Perhaps they can provide for the energy security of their country. Brazil has tried to use Petrobras to establish energy self-sufficiency. Maybe they help in pursuing policy aims of the government. We'll talk about that. And because they're in some way answerable to the government, perhaps they can develop resources at a pace that's more in the government's interest. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. This is a chart from the book. And what we tried to do here was take all of the details from the case studies and classify these kinds of non-oil burdens that NOCs have around the world. We group these into two categories. It's sort of a political science type of distinction between a social good, where it's something that helps a broad swath of the population. So that could be a fuel subsidy or just providing general revenue to support the government. Or they could provide private goods, which are things which are more narrowly targeted at elites. So maybe this is employment for politically connected people, or maybe it's patronage payments of various types. So we went through it and kind of classified these different countries and NOCs for what the NOC was doing in addition to oil, and how significant this burden was. Then we turned this into a composite rating, high, upper, middle, and low, of just how significant this burden was for the NOC. And we also, just to be controversial and start discussions, we classified a composite performance ranking for all of the NOCs in our study. And this was performance explicitly in hydrocarbon functions, and whatever the government asks the NOC to do related to oil and gas. So when we did this, we found that there's a pretty strong relationship between how big this non-hydrocarbon burden is on the NOC and how well it performs on hydrocarbon functions. I think one interesting message of this is that poor performance on the part of the NOC is not necessarily the fault of the NOC. It really tends to speak much more broadly to the system of government-NOC relations. That's a lot of what drives how NOCs perform and what they do. Okay, now I'm going to launch into discussion of all of these different things that we might be worried about and assess them based on some of our work. So should we be worried about the future of private oil companies? To think about this question, I find that a very helpful lens is risk. Risk is very fundamental to what the oil and gas industry is about. And this is a very stylized illustration of how risk may operate. And this really illustrates two things. One is the industry is incredibly capital intensive. So deep water wells could easily run actually significantly more than $100 million, but I put that up here to illustrate. And then you have these very expensive wells, exploration wells, and then you may drill dry holes. And so there's really extreme risk that you're putting a lot of capital at stake, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to outcome. So that's very fundamental. This is another way to illustrate those two components of risk, where you can see that different kinds of hydrocarbon activity have different characteristic risk. As an example, if you look up at the top, so new province exploration is very uncertain because no one's proven that the hydrocarbons are there commercially. But exploration wells, in the grand scheme of things, are relatively inexpensive. On the other hand, once you get down to new province development, there's less uncertainty about the hydrocarbons being there, but the capital investment is much more. So this is a way to think about classifying risk. And another interesting way to think about risk is how does it characteristically vary over the lifetime of a petroleum province. So as you might expect, initially it's very high uncertainty about whether hydrocarbons are there. Then it's high uncertainty about whether you can develop them and hit the production targets that you expect. But for at least conventional oil and gas, shale gas has a little bit, and unconventional resources have a bit of a different character. Once you kind of de-risk it and you develop it, it can produce for decades at quite low risk, which actually creates some of these dynamics of political risk for companies, worried that the governments, once they develop a field, the governments will say, thank you very much, you can leave now, we'll take the oil and gas. And then risk can go back up at the end when you start to think about various types of enhanced recovery. So what I'm going to talk about next is what we found through this study about some characteristic differences between NOCs and IOCs in how they manage, how they're able to manage risk, and also explanations for why these differences exist. It was one of the insights that we had going through this that risk is a quite useful way to think about what do NOCs do, what do IOCs do, and what do service companies do, which are quite different in how they relate to risk. So on the left, I'm going to show, well, what are some ways that you can manage risk in hydrocarbons? One of the most important is certainly to be real experts on the geoscience, to be able to know and model the subsurface well enough that your predictions are going to be better than everybody else's predictions, so you can bid more aggressively and more of your bets will come out the way you want. IOCs are pretty much forced to get good at this because this is what they compete on. They have to bid and say, well, we'll provide this signature bonus, we'll do this work plan, and convince a government that they're the best people to put in there. NOCs, in the majority of cases, with some exceptions now, but for the most part, they're not forced to compete in the same way. So they don't get as good at managing risk through knowledge. Another important way to diversify risk is through a global portfolio. If you're going to be throwing around billions of dollars, it's nice to at least have a lot of bets around the world that will sort of even each other out. Again, IOCs are really, in some sense, forced into being global, at least the biggest ones, because they're having to compete all around the world for the best opportunities. These NOCs may face political resistance in some cases to going abroad. They may not be able to compete abroad. And frankly, when you're so comfortable at home, it's hard to really get that excited about going abroad. And this chart illustrates that in the sample that we looked at. These are our 15 companies, and so it's measuring the portion of the working interest production that came from the home country. So you can see there are only really 5, maybe 6, if you include KPC, companies that started to go abroad in a significant way. And in all of these cases, this was pretty much only happened when these companies and their governments started to become seriously worried about resources declining at home. Another way you can manage risk, so I talked a bit about geological risk, but another very important risk is market risk, which doesn't exist in oil very much anymore. It used to exist before there was a refining infrastructure and a global liquid market, but it still is very much an issue with gas. Can I get these resources to the final customers? And that's a thing where it helps to have a global reach to be able to do that. And again, because they're competing abroad, IOCs are more likely to develop that global reach. And then finally, you can reduce risk through through capital cost reduction. If you skillfully engineer things so you're just putting less capital at risk for the same development, that means you don't have to absorb as much risk. And again, these kinds of cost issues for the IOC are extremely salient. These can have to do with whether the company survives or not. Does it meet the cost projections it thinks it will, and can it engineer lower costs? NOCs, because the government is the owner, they have what's called a soft budget constraint in most cases, which essentially means that there are few repercussions for major cost overruns and for things not going as well as you want. On the flip side, in the majority of cases, the government owners will also appropriate the profits. So there's not a lot of upside incentive for the NOCs to really reduce cost. The final element, you can share risk by partnering, and that's something that both NOCs and IOCs do to a very significant degree. There's a piece of follow-on research that we're doing that's related to how NOCs work with IOCs and how NOCs work with NOCs and what the differences are. And I'm going to show, this is just an illustration from a chapter that I co-authored with Pete Nolan, who was a retired geoscientist from BP. And this illustrates, so this was looking from the period of 1970 to 1989 at fraction of exploration wells that were drilled by a country's NOC versus were drilled by an IOC. So those are the gray bars. And this is normalized by whatever the deepwater frontier was in a given year. It's, of course, gotten deeper over time. So you can see as you move from left to right, those gray columns, which represent how many of the wells are operated by the NOC, get fewer. So this is one example illustrating how in deepwater, where it was very risky, the IOCs took the lead. This is another way to look at how have IOCs been engaged by countries and NOCs to work at frontiers. And I'll just point out that I think one interesting frontier here is, so this is from a database that we've put together of large projects between NOCs and IOCs. And so you can see that, for example, natural gas has been a frontier for a number of years, and in part because of its challenges where you have to construct a whole value chain from the resource to the consumer. But there are many areas where IOCs have engaged with NOCs to work at these frontiers. One of the most important frontiers, and I saw that you've already had several seminars on unconventional gas, but this is, as you know, is a very major paradigm shift in the hydrocarbon industry and in energy more generally. And so you can see that this is also showing the share of these NOC-IOC projects that are looking at different kinds of gas as a function of when the project started. And so you see a growing attention to unconventional gas as a frontier to work at. So basically, the answer is, should we be worried about the future of private oil companies? I would argue no, because there's always going to be a frontier. And the frontier may change, the nature of the industry may become more or less challenging, but in some sense, you're always going to need these kinds of companies that are better at taking risk or managing risk. What about NOCs as geopolitical weapons? Well, thinking about the things that we've already talked about, two points kind of jump out that make this a bit more challenging for a government to do than you might think from reading press accounts of the dangers of NOCs as geopolitical tools. So the first one is the fact that the hydrocarbon industry is so risk intensive and needs these risk management abilities. It also means that geopolitical actions that an NOC makes on behalf of its government, or that a government makes, can have pretty serious repercussions for how the hydrocarbons get developed or don't. So there's some actual constraints about the nature of the industry that make it harder to use NOCs as geopolitical tools. And then the second one, which is really important, is this principal-agent relationship again. The fact that the NOC's objectives are not necessarily the same as the government's. And we'll go through a few examples of how this plays out when governments do think about using NOCs as geopolitical tools. So one thing that we saw in a number of cases throughout the book is that often the NOC would drive things that help it get autonomy. So actions where the NOC is going abroad and acting abroad that are often perceived popularly as being initiated by the government, often it's initiated by the NOC because it wants to get away from all the constraints that the government places on how it operates. So it really can turn around the logic of it a bit. Let's look at three particular ways that you might use NOCs as geopolitical tools. So one of the most striking ones is you can just, if you're a country that supplies large amounts of energy to another country, you can tell your NOC, shut it off. Cut them off until they line up geopolitically with what we want them to do. The second one is maybe you can use the promise of resource access to create alignments of countries that you like, create desirable political alignments, which arguably PDVSA has tried to do. A third possible way to do this would be projecting influence by sending your companies abroad and trying to somehow lock up resources. And I suppose one logic of this might be a kind of a Malthusian logic that there's only so much oil and gas to go around, and so we better lock up all we can, and so then when the resource war comes, we'll have all the stuff. So let's look at the first one. So what about using it to cut off energy to people? I think the Gazprom case is very illustrative because one thing that we saw in doing the Gazprom study was where other people saw strength, we saw quite a lot of weakness. This is a chart that shows on the left, and with the red diamonds are on that left axis, which is natural gas sales from Gazprom. On the right axis, which is the sales are the pink bars are on the left axis. And then the right axis is revenues, which is the red diamonds. So what you see here is, and this is divided up into sales within Russia, sales in former Soviet Union countries, and sales in far abroad countries, which is everywhere else. So what you see here is Gazprom is incredibly dependent on revenues, mostly from Europe. And so in some sense, it's the last thing Gazprom wants to do to shut off exports. With that lens in mind, I think one sees these various gas conflicts a little differently. The most notable ones were in 2006 and 2009. There were disputes between Russia and Ukraine, a pipeline transit country. And I think when you start to think in these terms, you begin to see this more at its root. This is a high-stakes price negotiation. Now, it certainly can overflow into geopolitics, but the geopolitics are not the driver of what's happening here. And I thought this was this was from an earlier book at PESD on natural gas and geopolitics, where they looked at a number of case studies of international gas projects, and interestingly found that of the 11 instances where they saw contract interruptions, in only 3 of those 11 was the supplier country the initiator of the contract interruption. 4 cases were transit country, and actually 5 were the consumer countries. So that's, I think, a bit counterintuitive for people. Okay, what about this other approach? Can you use domestic resource access to forge political alliances? And certainly Venezuela and Hugo Chavez has made a show of doing this. there was a memo, PDVSA memo in 2006, where it explicitly talked about using access to Venezuela's rich reserves of heavy oil to develop a multipolar world through these NOC alliances. So a very grandiose view. The only trouble is if you look at these countries that were sort of politically aligned NOCs, Lukoil was the only one that actually knew something about heavy oil. And so if you look a few years later, I think the picture that they're putting out is more realistic, because you still need the people who actually know how to extract the resource. And so I think this was an interesting illustration of the limitations of your ability to do something geopolitical while ignoring the realities of oil and gas. It's a couple years. So the first one was 2006, and I think the bottom one was 2008 or 2009. So where they've got the American flag back, and so for the moment. So finally, I'll just say a brief word about this going abroad idea, because I think most people have caught on to this fact that, first of all, it doesn't really accomplish much for China in a fungible oil market. It's arguably this is just a subsidy to all of the oil-consuming countries around the world, because you're subsidizing the supply in places that maybe other countries are not going in. And this is something where I think even the Chinese government has started to realize this. So I would say today, the going abroad is really more motivated by these Chinese companies themselves that want to be freer of the strictures of operating in China. So I wouldn't worry too much about the geopolitical weapons. What about effects of NOCs on gasoline prices? These are a few mechanisms whereby you could affect gasoline prices. Exercise of market power, deliberate depletion policy where you're not extracting as quickly as another market player might. And I'll talk about the idea of target revenue for a government perhaps having effects on price. So certainly NOCs as instruments for their government could have an effect through market power. OPEC is, as everyone knows, a cartel. It's a poorly enforced cartel. And really the main driver of the success that it has is the ability of Saudi Arabia to hold spare capacity, to hold excess capacity. And so what this lets Saudi Arabia do is always be holding out the threat of undercutting alternatives on price. And so I think this is potentially quite meaningful in that this can discourage other investments if you always think that someone can flood the market with oil. The other thing is, because the cartel is not very well controlled, it actually creates uncertainty and price volatility, which in a certain sense can deter these investments much more than a steady high price would, where if you see a steady high price, you say, well, I'm going to invest in alternatives. Another way they can affect it is if they just hold off on depleting what they have very quickly. And this is a chart in the book from Paul Stevens. And it's basically the idea is that at every step of the way on a petroleum province development, you can decide, well, do I want to go forward with exploration? If I find something, do I want to develop it? If I develop it, do I want to produce it? And so an NOC could give a government a tool to make different choices at all of these steps relative to what an IOC would do. And maybe develop things more slowly, which would keep oil prices higher. I think in practice, this idea of planned depletion is probably a little bit oversold. I think often things that people will say is planned depletion may be inability to produce more, but theoretically this could be an effect on price. And then a third mechanism that I'm going to talk about is the idea of backward bending supply curves. So if you look up here, this is what you might think of as a conventional supply and demand curve for oil. Demand is fairly inelastic. And critically, if you have a profit maximizing player, as demand shifts out and price goes up, there are going to be more developments where the expected revenue is going to be above the marginal cost. And so the more price goes up, the more high cost resources people are going to be willing to develop. The question is, does this happen with NOCs? And here is a mechanism through which it may not happen that way. So governments are not necessarily profit maximizing. They're really looking for money to do things with. And so even while everyone always wants more money in a sense, there can basically be a target revenue of how much you need to run the government. And when demand does shift out and price increases, revenue is of course price times quantity. So if you're getting your revenue from a price increase, you don't need to be perhaps as focused on increasing the quantity. And so if that's the case, arguably your supply curve might look different, because once you started to get enough revenue, you really would focus less on efficiency and more on just perhaps leaning on NOCs because of the other non-oil things that you like about them. So if the supply curve for these NOCs starts to bend backwards, that does a few things that aren't very good for prices. One is that's going to kick that price up a lot, and then it's also going to make it more volatile because both the supply curve and demand curve are very vertical. And so this could be a dynamic that's preventing you from getting the supply response you want to a high price. And qualitatively, a number of our studies did seem to support this mechanism, where when prices were higher, governments in some sense would not be as focused on efficiency, and they would lean more on NOCs, and only when prices were lower would they start to draw in more heavily the private players. So I think effective NOCs on gasoline price is a very legitimate concern. Finally, I'll say a few brief words about environmental impact. And so what are some ways that NOCs could affect environment? Well, certainly effects on oil price have environmental impacts. One trick here is the relationships are quite complex, and it's sometimes hard to tell where this one goes. I think superficially, a lot of people think, well, the higher the oil price, the better, because that spurs the development of alternatives, of electric vehicles, or right now maybe natural gas vehicles. But it can also be complex, because a number of places around the world, natural gas prices are still linked to oil prices. And so if you make gas more expensive, maybe that's getting you more coal power instead of gas power. So that certainly has a serious greenhouse gas emission consequence. The fact of this oil price being volatile and potentially, there's the potential to always undercut the price, that also could have environmental impacts in different directions. On the one hand, it might discourage big investments in things that people worried about climate really don't like. Coal to liquids, oil sands. If you're putting money into something that's only profitable at a certain high oil price, if you have a doubt that'll stay high, you might not do it. But then the same might go for biofuels or other things that are maybe more environmentally friendly. So it's a complex effect. NOCs can, and I think do in some cases, have environmental effects just through their own less regulated, perhaps weaker environmental standards. Gas flaring is a major issue in a lot of parts of the world, although often I would argue this is not just about the NOC, it's about markets that don't allow a gas market to develop domestically. And then finally, through NOCs are often a vehicle for administering fuel subsidies. And fuel subsidies encourage massive overconsumption of fossil fuels around the world. And arguably, they're not something that NOCs inherently like, because they usually, as you saw with the Gazprom example, cost the NOCs a lot of revenue. But NOCs are a vehicle often for administering fuel subsidies, because it's hard to provide really cheap fuel unless you have someone you can tell to sell it more cheaply than a market price. And this is just an example from the World Energy Outlook showing the extent of fuel subsidies in different places around the world. And in a very, this seems quite aggressive to me, but I thought it was interesting. They were arguing, if you look at that lower chart, that if tomorrow there were complete removal of fossil fuel subsidies around the world, that you would roughly get halfway to the greenhouse gas emissions trajectory that you need for 450 ppm. So, it's a bit hard to see exactly how they did that calculation, but I think the general point is very true, that fuel subsidies are a huge contributor to overconsumption around the world, and the existence of NOCs does help facilitate these fuel subsidies. So environmental impacts, I'm going to go with a yes as well. So this is my final wrap-up of how NOCs play into some of these different concerns. And I guess depending on which of these you're most worried about, you'll leave the talk either cheered or discouraged. So, but anyway, so thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
My question is kind of about the workforce of these NOCs.
Yes.
So obviously at IOC, we're all fairly familiar. They have very diverse, employees from all around the world,
Yes.
all held very accountable and so forth for
Yep.
the most part. So the NOCs, like for instance, Saudi Aramco, what's the port? Is it like less than 1% foreigners, 10% foreigners? Is it more like on a consultant basis?
It's essentially 0% foreigners. So Saudi Aramco is a very interesting example where they managed to keep alive. So as you probably know, Saudi Aramco was originally formed over the course of the 70s from the big IOCs that were operating in the country. So initially it was very heavily foreigners, but it's transitioned to be essentially completely Saudi. And it's been very impressive that they've maintained that legacy of an effective, competent corporate culture over that time period. But it's interesting because you see where you see a lot of the tensions in the workforce with Saudi Aramco is that the Saudi government would like there to be more employment of Saudi nationals. And I've heard anecdotally, I mean, I can't this perhaps apocryphal, but I think there's some element of truth there, that they actually have a building where they put the people who aren't good enough to actually do the real work and just say, okay, sit in the building, play on your computer, do whatever you want, but we don't want you screwing up our excellent company, right? So that, I mean, I think it's quite an interesting example, the Saudi case.
Thank you very much. I just want to go back to your point on geopolitical weapons, specifically as it relates to Russia, and I just have a few, I guess, objections to your findings. Is one, the chart you showed of the price or the revenues and the sales between Soviet Union, Russia, and Europe. I've been studying natural gas in Russia, and the problem I see is if and I don't know if in your research you did a kind of a crisis scenario if Russia were to cut off the gas to, say, Europe. But from my research and what I've seen is if Russia were to cut off the gas, since gas is subsidized heavily in Russia and former Soviet Union, they could raise prices in there, make up some of the difference, not all of it, and that Russia could survive without European revenues for about 2 to 3 months max, while Europe could only survive without Russian gas for about a couple of weeks. If you need the exact source, I can give it to Dr. Rai and have it sent to you. And furthermore, on the pie chart you showed about that right there about user countries cutting off contracts. Seeing your source right there, the book of 2006, I believe.
Sure.
I think the title of the book is International Natural Gas Markets and Economics. I believe
No,
it is.
this is natural gas and geopolitics.
Natural gas. Okay. And one thing I would posit from your findings is that many of those user country contracts were cut off, I would say, in the 1990s, because, as you probably know, Russia was in a major crisis as far as its energy markets and its exports, and the leverage Europe had versus Russia was far, far greater than it is now. It's much more reverse. So I would say that just based on what I see there, I'm really not convinced that it is a geopolitical, it's not a geopolitical
and this
threat.
chart was actually, so that book looked at it had 7 different case studies for gas projects around the world. So the majority of these are actually not Russia. I don't remember the exact breakdown of which ones were and weren't. To your previous point, I mean, I think, so I'm not denying at all that a cutoff of natural gas to Europe, for whatever reason, could be very serious. And in fact, there were cutoffs, right? I mean, the 2006 and 2009, and there were serious impacts. I mean, I think Bulgaria was very seriously impacted. My point is, I don't see a plausible scenario whereby geopolitics would drive this. I mean, you're right. I mean, if there was some massive high-level war, the bets are probably off, right? And that's, and I think the same goes for, China. I mean, it's not really my area of expertise. Well, what happens if you have, World War III? But I think that, the point I would make is it's just not, it doesn't really align with Russia's interest well at all to have those geopolitics drive a kind of gas shutoff. For example, saying, well, I want to get Europe back into line, I'm going to shut off the gas for a while, that strikes me as very implausible. So,
kind of along those same lines, though, they can choose. I mean, anybody who has a significant supply of a natural resource can choose who their customers are going to be. I mean, it's one of the
No, I mean, I would argue with oil that's not true. I mean, you can. It's certainly true in the narrow sense. I can decide if I make a contract with country X. So the U.S. can decide, well, we're not going to buy from Nigeria anymore, or we're not going to buy from Iran, or those countries could decide not to sell it to us. But as a practical matter, in a fungible sort of market like oil is, that has, I would argue, very negligible significance in the real market.
And I'm sorry, I don't know Russia as well as Robert does, but isn't it true that Russia has actually used natural gas prices to gain some leverage over European utilities infrastructures? Yeah,
well, so I think, and this is where it becomes very hard to tease out. I mean, you're absolutely right that I think, Russia did make efforts to sort of play different European countries off of each other, and this was, back when gas prices were higher and less uncertain. And so yeah, I mean, I think there was some effort to, play different countries off each other as far as doing bilateral contracts. And you're right also, I mean, that Gazprom bought up a lot of assets in other kinds of energy and including oil and gas and other places in Europe. And so yes, I mean, I think there's there's some leverage there, but I guess it's not it's not something where I would see it so much as a geopolitical leverage that they're actually getting off of that. I mean, I think a lot of what they have tried to do is to forestall other pipeline routes, right? So that would not involve Russia. So pipeline routes from Central Asia, and I think that's a lot of what they've been doing with playing people off each other in a different way. But I would still argue that ultimately that comes down to an economic driver of wanting to be able to sell their gas to everybody. And certainly the more that people are only able to buy your gas, the better economically for Russia. And maybe at the margins in geopolitics too.
So how do you think that NOCs can improve the usage of natural gas with all the new shale gas around the world even? Or is it not really a NOC thing? Maybe it's more a political thing?
Well, so the country that's doing the most as far as its NOCs to try to look at shale gas so far is China. So CNPC has a number of projects with Shell. And now the Chinese government has done things to try to open up Chinese shale a bit more to other NOCs and other players in addition to CNPC. So you have, I think it was maybe Sinopec that took a big interest in Devon shale resources. So I think it's definitely starting to happen that there are these NOC-IOC pairings. And that's actually something that we're explicitly looking at right now, because I think that's a very interesting question. Will those, will NOCs be able to effectively learn how to exploit shale gas through those pairings? What, of the many factors that made shale gas happen so quickly in the U.S., which of those can other countries successfully replicate? So I think on that it's a very, very early in that story still. And I think there's just a lot of variation. And certainly some countries, China's probably the one where the NOCs have done the most to start looking at that. I mean, leaving aside also, Norway and Statoil, but I think, for looking at it domestically, China's one of the out ahead.
I was very interested in what you said as far as if you look at the actual production of oil, it's not like when China goes somewhere else, they're shipping that oil right back to China.
Right.
Instead, it's a profit maximizing behavior. Mm-hmm. So I noticed Angola was on your map there, and I know China is extremely involved there.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just comment on that a little bit more and what your findings were there.
Yeah. Well, I guess, so that's right. There's I think it's Sonangol, Sinopec Internet, or is it? Yeah, but there are definitely a lot of pairings with China and Angola. I guess there are various dimensions to look at the whole China and Africa thing, and I think some people worry about that from different directions. They worry about, well, is it going to be bad for development outcomes because China's going into bad places, or they're not as worried about good governance, or is it kind of going to displace IOCs? I think one of the things that is actually maybe one of the most interesting differences perhaps about how China will work in some of those countries is potentially not relying as much on indigenous resources and on global service companies. So those are two things that when you look at the major IOCs, if you look at companies in Nigeria, the majors, their workforce is almost entirely Nigerian, and at the executive level, not as much, but there's still a lot of Nigerian executives, and they all rely heavily on the global services industry. So that strikes me as one interesting thing to think more about. That does China have more of, in some sense, vertical integration, where it's using its own Chinese both employees and then also services type companies, even when they're affiliates of the big NOCs. But yeah, they're certainly active in many places. Angola also, the IOCs are very active there as well.
Yeah, you sort of talked a little bit about, I guess one of your things was environmental and resource depletion, or what's the motivation for these different companies. So can you imagine reading some of these factors you've talked about, like the percentage of activities that are abroad for any particular IOC versus their supposed reserves or the production rates, and how to read that in terms of, can you imagine a way to read those factors in terms of peak oil production or something like that? Can you imagine how to sort of read into things that people wonder about, like what's really the reserves of the OPEC countries, and looking at their actions to inform those kinds of decisions, or is it just too blurry?
Well, so I guess my opinion, I don't worry too much about reserves, and partly because of what reserves are, right? And I think it's, this is the thing that I think that at least some people coming from a peak oil perspective have this idea that there's a giant oil drum, under the ground, and you're just tapping out of it until it's gone. And the key points about reserves are two things. It's how much can you extract at current prices and with current technology. So it's something where I mean, and I know Matthew Simmons made a big deal about Saudi Arabia's reserves being less than they were saying, and they got angry and sort of retorted. But I guess my answer is, it's just not clear to me that matters that much, and especially when Saudi Arabia's reserves or stated reserves are so enormous. They're producing some fraction of it, and I think the whole unconventional resources kind of revolution is a great example of why I don't worry all that much about reserves. I mean, it was a shocking change where just a few years ago, people were talking about how many regasification terminals the U.S. was going to have to build, and now it's, okay, well, those terminals that we built that are totally empty, can we turn them around, right? At least, get partway to a liquefaction type of terminal. So that's my own view, because I think unconventional was a textbook example of gas prices were very high, and where you had a regime where people were able to get access to infrastructure, they were able to experiment, that they pushed that way beyond what people thought were the limits of gas in North America. So, perhaps that's a rosy view, but as I will kind of say, climate change is something I worry about. Peak oil is not something I lose a second of sleep over. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.